On the Level podcast, your Masonic podcast. Join the hosts Billy McIntyre and Sam Earl Sedgey as they delve into the world of Freemasonry.
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of On the Level podcast. I am with our host, Billy McIntyre. How are you, Billy?
And I'm with Sam Earl Sedgey. It's the co-host. I can't take any glory away from this man. This man is working hard to bring you this content we got going, and this is going to be the best one yet as far as history.
Well, Billy, you are the visionary. You're the man with insurmountable power that brought this whole thing to fruition. And if it wasn't for, your stewardship and your leadership and your infectious enthusiasm, we wouldn't be having so much fun and reaching out to so many people listening to us talking about the fantastic organization called Freemasonry, which we're a part of and which we enjoy so much. And the Knights. Well, this is part 3 of the Knights Templar historical episode, and it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed going through a lot of stuff, and it seems like a lot of people have enjoyed it, and they're brimming about it. And you guys seem to be one of the most popular videos that we put up on the interwebs. So I've really had a good time.
Yeah, so if you would share it with your friends, if you think someone would enjoy it, or maybe someone that's not a Mason yet that you think that guy'd be good. Maybe you could use this to kind of open their eyes a little bit to what the Masons really are.
That's right. I mean, just a bit of a recap. So episode 1 for our Knights Templars was episode 9. So if you want to go, I would suggest for those who are just tuning in for the first time, I mean, you can go back, but it would be nice if you go to episode 9. And that episode's called Knights Templar. And then episode 11 is Knights Templar Part 2. And what episode 1 was, episode 9 basically, I don't want to confuse you guys. What episode 9, the basis of the first Knights Templar series that we've done, was to give you an understanding of where a lot of the doctrine and the formation and the ideology of the creation of Knights Templar were kind of like the legacy, the origins from St. Augustine's Cistercian monk order to St. Benedict, who basically was not only integral to the Cistercian order and led it, was integral to the Knights Templar order, as he was basically, let's just say, one of their biggest, if not main PR guy within the Vatican, who pushed not only for them heavily, but as I said before, was in that important council meeting where he advocated that the Templars should have, absolute autonomy, with the exception of being, they only basically were under the privilege and under the power of the Pope and no one else, and they were basically autonomous, and no king and no realm could touch him. They were untouchable in the massive they were until a king called Philip the Fair in the very early 1307, I believe, started to raise false charges and accusations against them after many years of, building up a case against them.
And loyal service.
So, so that's what episode 9 on the Knights Templars was, to give you understanding. And that was very important, because without the organizational structure, without the structure of having monthly meetings and getting together and every brother being equal and every brother playing their part to the best of their skill sets that they brought up to the table, that merit-based integration of going through the chairs and then being elected as commander of your priory, or what we call the commandery, and being elected amongst your brothers based on your merits and value, whether that was in combat warfare strategy, having the right person to be the treasurer of that particular place, which, and that was equally as important to the man who, drew the sword and stood against, defended the Christian faith to a great extent. The guy who was, in charge of maintenance of the buildings. As you know, one thing that I haven't mentioned that I should have mentioned, because there's a lot of stuff that I kind of say in my kind of like my preamble in lectures that I give out about Knights Templars around the USA and around the world, is every book that you buy about Knights Templars, or nearly every book that I've read that's done by some great historians around the world, especially British historians who write on American historians, and kind of like their preamble or in their first chapter, they always mention, oh, and the Knights Templars had these great, fantastic fortresses, built these magnificent fortresses that were impenetrable, and their fortresses still today are, can be seen in these particular places in the Middle East and in places of Europe, blah blah. Now, what's not explained through there, even though they make these great factual statements, is, well, who built them? Who built them? Who built these fantastic? How were they able to build these things? They didn't wave a wand,
Right.
And so that's really important, because it's aligning. So let's break this down. So I think this is an important part to talk about before I go into what was explained in episode 11. Back then, building fortresses or citadels or great walls like the Wall of Acre that protected the city of Acre, or Jerusalem, other places. This was unique military tech. This was technology that was kind of like super secret, confidential. You will hear battles where the enemy could not assail the Templar fortresses until someone within the Templar force, that was usually a hired mercenary or a non-Templar soldier, who would literally betray the Templars through the secret castle door and let the enemy in, because they had enough. And these nutcases, the Templars, would never give up. But they were more thinking about themselves. I mean, there are actual historical documents where the Templars got betrayed, and that's how they got in, and this is all historically documented. But otherwise, they would have held for months and months and months and months. And so the question is where were they able to become great builders of tech? So this is where we go into the episode 9, where it explains that taking on a large format of the Cistercian order, where Knights Templars were not only guys, because when we think of Knights Templars, we think of warrior monks that went to battle and clashed with the sword. But then every historian will tell you, that we've got some great and good ones, say, well, there's about 20,000 Knights Templars. So hold on. There was about 20,000 Knights Templars, but only 2,000 of them were soldiers and warriors. So 18,000 Knights Templars, and what they mean by that, sometimes they don't articulate it really well, because it's all in their heads, is that there were 20,000 men of the order in Europe. Now that's a rough ball. Some people argue, no, there was 40,000 and 4,000 soldiers, or no, there was 80,000 Knights Templars, and 10,000 of them were warriors. I'm not going to dispute the numbers. Generally, the consensus is amongst a lot of people there was 20,000. There could have been more. I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it at some point in the future, where we'll find a record that will state there was 80, 20, 100,000. That number doesn't matter, but let's stick to the 20,000 and then 2,000 were soldiers. What were the other 18,000 Knights Templars? The ones who were admitted to the order, who were also brothers, right? Let's talk about military organizations and operation today. Today, when you have your frontline soldiers, there's a lot of logistical support. There's a lot of logistical support of getting them with military planes, let's just say, or military navy ships to the location. And then you need the transports. Who transports them to the base, and how do they get out from the base, and who maintains the equipment, the vehicles,
who brings in the food,
who brings in the food. There's an entire economy, a logistical economy behind that, and that was the case with the Knights Templars. They had a logistical autonomous economy that was fueling their war funds and their campaigns, and they were extremely wealthy, extremely as has been stated in a lot of great historical books by some great historians as well, my great counterparts, and but my point being is, how did they build these particular buildings? Well, first of all, like with the Cistercian order, which go back to episode 9, and that explains that, and the link between the Knights Templars, is the idea is that you prayed, you did your ritual, and then you worked on a certain craft. Now, one thing that I left out was another craft was building. And building was really important. Keeping the maintenance of a building, keeping the roof of a barn solid during a bad storm, maintaining your commandery building, or whatever building, or your chapter house, or whatever you want to call it, right? Maintaining a building even today is a cost, right? And so imagine maintaining a building where there are 50 Knights Templars, 100 Knights Templars, 800 Knights Templars, 1,000 Knights Templars. Those are Templars that are constantly using the utilities of the building, whether it's practicing outside in martial warfare, whether it's feeding horses, were a massive upkeep. Massive. I mean, even today, trying to raise and upkeep a horse is phenomenally expensive. And
these were the big war horses too. These aren't your quarter horses that we raised that people see most of the time.
Absolutely,
these were big draft horses.
These were big draft horses, war horses. There was a whole economy on that scale, but we forget, how did they build all these commanderies, these priories all around Europe? You go to Temple in London right now, still standing today in London is Temple, which is the commandery building, the priory, the main building of the Knights Templars in London, which escaped the Great Fire of London in 1666, which has still Grand Masters of Knights Templars lying there in basically, they have their graves in the temple, and there. You have commandery still around England, a lot of them in ruins, basically in France, everywhere. All this cost, all this material, all this quarry, and who was building it? It wasn't. I mean, was it some fictional, mythical people that just moved in and just suddenly built something? Who were these people that were dedicated to the craft and built these buildings with great masonry, tech masonry, stone masonry, where they were unrivaled in fortress building? Well, a couple of things. We are aware of the guilds. There were guilds at that time. If you go to the Regus manuscript that was discovered in the 1200s, it claims that in the time of Athelstan, which I'm glad that it's coming out, because Athelstan's been a major character for me for years, especially when you get more involved in masonry. He was the first king of England, but the Regus manuscript talks about Athelstan getting, and this is 1200s, they discovered this, and it says in this document basically alleges that in the year of the 920s, it's about 925, 26, 27, Athelstan got the Masons of England together, and the Masons being the builders, those who build the great fortresses, the great cathedrals, all that, and sat down and organized them and created basically, I guess, your first unionized industry of stone builders and construction men, and gave them, a charter, gave them rules, great lines like "manners maketh a man," which is kind of interesting. It's in how you behave. So there's a lot of content. Some of it's kind of, I mean, when you read it, I've read it, Old English, and actually it translated into modern day today's English. And some of it's kind of really stringent. It's like, oh, that's a bit harsh. But if you read it, it says what type of person can become a Mason, what are the rules and regulations, what is the charter, and then it's got how to behave as a Mason. So it goes through all your. This is our expectation, and it was kind of in depth. It was a way of life as well, and again, if you looked at it, it was very, very, very similar to the same doctrine the Cistercian monks had and what the Knights Templars took on. And the idea is what people don't understand is like a lot of that craft was maintained. You know, how did the monks around Christendom suddenly have these great cathedrals? Who built them?
Right.
Now there wasn't this mystical guild of powerful stonemasons who knew this ancient technology secret stuff. It was tech that these guilds have had for centuries. And here's what people forget. Here's what people forget. And so we're talking about 900 years, after after the Lord of the Year of Jesus Christ, basically.
Yeah.
Not so long. People need to and a lot of people forget that the conversion from Judaism to Christianity is Christianity was Judaism 2.0. It was supposed to be the next thing. It was supposed to be their savior coming. And so a lot of rabbis who were the leaders of the Hebrew people became Christians. That's how it all kind of started. There was a cataclysm, I guess the Hebrews would say, where a lot of people, traditionalist Hebrews, took on the New Testament, let's just say, and became Christians. And so the knowledge base from the building of the Temple of Solomon and the building of Israel and the building of the second Temple of King Solomon, a lot of that tech and that labor of builders in that realm, and that was passed down to the Christians, because it was literally, Rabbi Shlow or whatever is now has joined this religion, and his tribe and his people and his community that have passed down generations of. And what the Hebrews were really good at was passing down and keeping their trade, whatever their trade may be, whether it was cattle farming, whether it was stonemasonry, they were able to continue to pass their trades down generation after generation quite strictly, and actually formalize it in particular guilds or particular sects of their, when I say sect, I mean sect, SECT, and have organization. They were very well organized in that sense, and that's how they built the first temple of King Solomon. And then that's how
I have a question about the building, and this has bothered me for a long time, and I know you've done a lot of research, so they say there's no stupid question, but hold on to your hats, because here's one. So it's pretty commonly known that the Templars did a lot of traveling on their ships. That they did get credit for our time, and, there's a lot of people that believe that we're in America before Columbus. And that's the reason Columbus used the Knights Templar symbol on their ships, so that the locals would recognize them as a friend as opposed to a foe. So my question is, there's these great monuments all over the world, and they'll say, well, how did they build that at this time? Is it possible that the Knights Templars were building some of these things and they've just never got credit for them?
So here we go. So let's break this down, because what I want to do is I want to explain to the audience around the world how these things came to pass. And so when a lot of the Hebrews adopted Christianity, and Christianity spread like wildfire, and then it spread through the Roman Empire through Constantine, who made it the official religion. You forget, go to Rome and go to see the insane buildings the ancients built that still stand today. It will blow your mind. Whether it's the Colosseum, whether it's different places that are still standing erect that you can go and see, you will be shocked with the craftsmanship. I mean, you can go even to Greece and see a lot of the buildings that are still, in
Right.
These. Now, when people adopt the religion, or the religion that's on fire, or the religion that's really become dominant.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand that pre-Christianity, a lot of the major kind of great constructions were places of deity and worship. In the minds of the kings, of the pharaohs, the emperors, what not better to build a temple dedicated to the god that you are most aligned to, because it was a testament to your devotion to that god. People were extremely religious, whether it was the pagan gods, whether it was the Old Testament god of the Hebrews, whether it was Christianity. That basically was like a lightning storm, a massive after Constantine's. And you got to remember, Christianity was something that was growing and vibrant and spreading, and it wasn't the fact that Constantine woke up and was like, let's make Christianity the main religion. It's because it was spreading like wildfire. It was spreading like wildfire. Jesus, walked on water, brought a man back to life, all these things, and people, and all the documents, all the apostles who died, claiming that all of this, it just spread like wildfire. And to control the empire with this brazen new kind of like this religion that people were willing to die for by just talking. It was the amount of martyrdom that was going on. People not being violent, but saying, this is the truth and I'm willing to die for it. You crucify me, you can hang me. I am not, this is what my ancestors, this is what we saw. And
I won't deny it.
I won't deny it. And the actual zealousness of it brought Christianity to the forefront. And Constantine, who was, a very smart man, kind of like adopted it. And then it took over Europe like absolute wildfire. And so the builders, the ancients or whatever, usually that kind of tech and that craft that they've carried through the ages and they've passed down, the Phoenicians and all that kind of stuff, all of this gets picked up, and suddenly that Phoenician that was a pagan follower is now a Christian follower, but they still have the same craft, they still been taught the same skills that's been applied for generations after generations, but now they're applying it to, and what not great honor to have as a stone builder, as a mason, right? But to build a place of worship for your God, because that was everything you had. Life was so miserable and horrible that the worship of deity was so large, because, as we just discussed in episode 9 and 11, a cut could kill you. The amount of people you would see around your family and around your village die of just normal things, and how horrible and how short life expectancy was, that people were extremely religious. People were praying on a daily basis because life was hell. To a great.
But they didn't know they'd be alive tomorrow.
No, they wouldn't.
You'd be healthy today and gone the next day.
No, gone the next day. Anything can happen. It was such an unstable period, a hugely unstable period in those times, that faith was tantamount. It was extremely important for a lot of people. And so to be a builder and then to put your craft, your heart, your soul into building these monolithic churches in your devotion to Christ, to your God. And you get the same in other religions when it comes to mosques, or when it comes to temples that the Hebrews built all around the world, even today. Places of worship. There's a lot of devotion to the building. There's a lot of expense is put in. A lot of people put in a lot of money, or today donate a lot of money to their local church. A lot of wealthy people pour millions and millions of dollars to erect these fantastic places of worship. Still today, although not to the extent that they did back in those days. Those days were much huger. So you had a craft. And you see, Athelstan brought the Masons together under his tenure and under his Lord Jesus Christ and God, to build these places of not only devotion but also build settlements, also build defense structures. Okay. Now, a lot of the stonemasons, or what I call Freemasons,
Mm-hmm.
because they were very special in the sense that they were able to travel like priests and kind of like, you know, very freely around Europe because of their skill. And back then, in the guilds, we know that it was passed down, the skills, orally, and so there was an initiation of becoming an apprentice, becoming a fellowcraft.
Mm-hmm.
Then once you've passed a certain skill set and you've proven your time under the master, you'll become a master of your craft, and so you got something like master mason, basically.
Sure.
And the idea is, and what's really interesting with that kind of formula, you got the apprentice, the fellowcraft, and the master mason. Those give you some certain rights and privileges that are very common today. Like, for example, you start work as an apprentice in a particular job, and in some countries, legally, your job is kind of precarious because you're kind of taking an apprentice role. You're not fully protected. If you're not really good, they can let you go without
Mm-hmm.
any real ramifications. Like, I'm really sorry, mate, you're not going for it. See you later. And that company doesn't really have any legal ramifications or whatever.
Right.
But once you become fellowcraft, it's like, okay, well, you've passed this. You got job security for at least a minimum of 12 months to 2 years, a 2-year job security, and this is the benefits that we can give you on top of doing this. And then after your third year, let's just say, as being becoming a master builder or whatever, a foreman or whatever. Now here's your job security. You're pretty much set as long as you don't screw up and don't burn us or whatever. And the construction company's doing well, doing bountifully
Yeah.
well. You're in. You're in.
Well, the reason I ask is because, and I mean, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole without trying to, but I think it's pretty much common knowledge now that things, even like the pyramid, and I'm not saying the Masons built the pyramid, don't get me wrong, but we don't know who built that. Okay. We know that the Egyptians used it for burial, but all signs point that wasn't built for that. Okay. Whether people want to argue that, that's debatable, and we weren't back there, we don't know. But it doesn't appear like the Egyptians built that. That's what I'm getting at. But yet they turned it into kind of a mausoleum for their rulers. So I'm just wondering, is there any evidence that possibly when these Templars were sailing the seas and discovering new lands, and whether they be hiding their treasure or they be what they're doing, could they have built some of these great monuments?
Well, let's go back to the early part. And I really don't like talking about numbers
Mm-hmm.
because these are interpretations and kind of
Mm-hmm.
estimates. And the problem is, when you go back several hundred years, those estimates can be way off. So when they say 20,000 Templars and 2,000 troops, it really could be 50,000 Templars and
Mm-hmm.
20,000 troops. It could be 100. We just don't know, and it's just what the consensus is today, and that consensus can change once more documentation was unearthed. The problem we have is that the dismantlement of the order formally, everything went underground.
Mm-hmm.
So although there's a lot of paperwork that we can delineate from, we only can
And they
make
tried to
estimates.
erase them
Now,
from
now,
history
now,
too.
my point being, though, is, remember I said only 2,000 were military soldiers,
Right.
or whatever the number is. There was a proportion of that number, a small proportion of elite number, were SAS Delta Force warriors. The other 18,000, though, there was a large force of them that were builders. They were
Mm-hmm.
builders. They were Knights Templars. They were monks. They were guys who would go through the ritual. They would be in the stated meetings. They were the master of the works. There'll be siege masters. There'll be, and some of them will be indoctrinated in a military form, but may not be part of the offensive military, which was the Knights Templars, who would go out and basically go, let's charge, and
Yeah.
but they were part of the military organization in terms of, siege master
Defending
builders,
the council and
defending, back then, building castles and fortresses especially in the Holy Land, were equally as important than the standing army. If you go to today, and there are documentaries on this that are done by some fantastic, venerable people, you just have to see what they built under Acre, the underground network they built under Acre that can move armies, like a massive escape route. And the fact that Templars built this, it was just phenomenal. People couldn't even they how could this happen? How could they have built this? How could they have this was a military organization that was constantly planning for war, constantly planning for all situations, and they were great builders. And that's when you see in the book saying, oh, they built these mighty fortresses, they were great builders. So yes, when you say there were Templars going around, all that kind of stuff, what I'm trying to say is it's very likely that they did go around and still beyond their official dismantlement, still went around and built quite a bit in terms of, great fortresses, buildings, networks, all sorts of things, because that's what they did. You remember they were great shipbuilders as well. There wasn't a shipping company. There wasn't a shipping company that back then called, I don't know, Shipbuilders Are Us, that built the great. It was funded by the Templars, and not only they fund it, but they got all the great shipbuilders and basically co-opted them into their organization.
Yeah.
Okay, but there's a reason for that. They kept things within the order. This was very important. They didn't want to give the tech to the enemy. And there's a few things that are actually really important to note, and the reasons why, which later shows the importance of these military orders back then, especially knightly orders. If you go forward, sadly, 200 years after the fall of the Templars, the fall of Constantinople, which was the place of the Holy Emperor, which the Ottoman Empire took over. Well, there was mercenaries, and there were mercenary engineers, and there was one mercenary engineer that went to the emperor, the Holy Roman Empire of Constantinople, and said, "Hey, look, I have this new design. It's this massive bombard cannon, and this could change the war if I put it on your battlement, and if the Ottomans come, you can blow them to pieces, and that could change the tide of people trying to assault and keep attacking you." And sadly, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was only now the Holy Roman Emperor of just one city, because the Byzantine Empire had dwindled massively. The Christian Byzantine Empire had dwindled massively, and they had really no support from the Christian Europeans to a great extent. Didn't have the money, so sadly he had to turn down this engineer who was from Eastern Europe, and he was a Christian. But guess what? This engineer then went to the Sultan, Mehmet, who wanted to take the city out because his father failed in his time.
Yeah.
And sold him the tech and basically built this huge bombard cannon. And that's dangerous because suddenly now you've given this great Muslim army a technology that no one else had that could cause a massive amount of damage and breach the walls. Now, thankfully, Mehmet was a bit of a hothead and he pushed that cannon to the extremes during the days because it only could fire like 7 times a day, and he broke it for overheating out of his impatience. He eventually took the citadel, the city of Constantinople, eventually, but it took him a lot of time and a lot more resource than he expected, and for those guys going read it. But my point being is the reason why the military orders will co-opt these guilds and these people and these crafts is to make sure that their enemy, and these for them back then they called them the infidels, and it just happened to be the Muslims. They were the enemy. This was a clash of civilization, but it was not only a clash of civilization. This was a way of life. You had the Christian way of life. You had this is our faith. This is our doctrine, and then you had that way of life, and they basically buckled heads, and it wasn't compatible. Two could not coexist. And this is the reason why they were, either the Muslim empires would come and take over, and it'd be predominantly just, a Muslim place, and that was it, or, it was a Christian place like in Spain, and then, eventually they were able to, the Christians were able to reclaim Spain and all that kind of stuff and hold their ground, but it was predominantly, Christian for a very, very long time. And it's the notion of secular societies that we have today is alien, would have been alien, actually may have been heretical in back. The people would have thought you're a heretic for being secular. These kind of concepts were not even entertained. And if they were closed down fairly quickly. These were very draconian. Some would say Christianity back then, in Catholicism and Islam, were a hell of a lot more draconian than they are today in terms of the rules and hierarchy. So you have these ancient guilds that have built these crafts over millennia being co-opted. Athelstan co-opting the stonemason guild, the Freemason guilds. And now, here's where there is speculation, and we have got documents, which I'm not going to go into in this show, that allege, and these are hundreds of years old, that allege that, and this is where, for me, things tend to change, because if these documents said, if a stonemason entered Jerusalem, their eligibility to enter was to automatically join a knightly order, it'd be like, okay, it says stonemason. But the documents that I've seen and we have says if a Freemason was to enter Jerusalem or the Holy Land and say, hey, I'm a mason, I'm a builder. And usually back then, the Freemason would have been a man of the craft, would have been a builder. But what I'm trying to say is that there was an element of, there could have been speculative Freemasons as well. And I think that's important because, and people say, well, why would there be a speculative Freemason? And what we mean by speculative Freemason is a Mason who is not an actual stonemason who can build buildings and stuff like that, but is a Freemason in terms of someone who acknowledges the initiation and the rituals and the allegories to become a master mason, understand the history of that particular order that was passed down through the generations and through the millennia. And so, because we have documents that literally say that to be a Freemason and for a Freemason to enter, you have to join a knightly order, that was mandatory. If you were a craftsman of a certain, and you happen to be a Freemason, you were obliged to join. And the top order was the Knights Templars, and then it codified, what particular, where you were from, you will be in a certain place in a certain quarter, all that kind of stuff. Now, why would they say that? My question is why? Why would you automatically have to be co-opted into a knightly order? Well, this was a place where they were under constant warfare. They were under constant siege. There was always constant back and forths. And it was the place where was the most volatile in sense of the number of crusades that there were, the number of sultans that tried to get back the Holy Land in the name of Islam, and the amount of Christians that wanted to, maintain Jerusalem or take back Jerusalem, depending on what period of the crusades that we're talking about. So it was a place of constant warfare and constant shenanigans and, knightly orders and Muslim orders like the Hashashin and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the point is that a builder, a craftsman, and back then to be a craftsman, you had to be a certain elite of the elite in terms of your craft. This wasn't like any Joe Schmo, you're a craftsman, you come in. It took years to train a craftsman. It took about 7 years for a builder to become a master mason and to master his art. And even then, there was more. And obviously, there was a lot of innovation. people found out and different ways and more smarter ways of more effective ways of building certain things, and all of that knowledge was kept within the craft. And so the Templars not only co-opted those particular guilds within their own remit. You have to understand with the Cistercian order parts that they co-opted in the meetings, it all formed. And so the initiation rites. And so we'll get into more about when the Templars were formed, the Nine Knights, and then they got Jerusalem. They were in Jerusalem, and they were given the Rock of the Dome, where the second temple of King Solomon was underneath, and all that kind of stuff, and the stuff that they've allegedly discovered, and a lot of it may sound profound, but a lot of it's common sense stuff, and then it derives back to the time of King Solomon and the building of the Temple of King Solomon. And people need to understand all this because it's really important, because the building of the second temple, the first temple, was supposed to be, in the Jewish tradition and for the Hebrews, was supposed to be the divine place where the house of God. This was the house of God. It was built for God. It was built for the high priest to commune with God. They're the biggest kind of like the achievement or biggest kind of like devotion or want from the Hebrews and their religion was to be able to build a temple where they had a connection with God and a house for God, and have some sort of divine connection within that building. And if you go through the history and go through the schematics of the first temple that was built in 3000 BC, and then so it would have been 3,025 years ago was when the first temple was built, and then that got destroyed, and then the second temple was built. So it wasn't 3000 BC. My apologies. It was basically 1,000 years before Christ. The first temple was just 3,025 years from today. It was built, and then for it to fall, and then the whole tragedy of King Solomon in his later years, and all the idol worship and all that kind of stuff that broke up the tribes of Israel and the kingdoms of Israel. We'll get into that in a later episode because there is a lot to unpack. But what I'm trying to evaluate here in this episode is there was a construction corporation within Knights Templars to do it in as much layman's terms. And these were some of the best crafters and guilders of construction in all of Europe, in the world. And not only were they co-opted, but also their traditions were installed as well, as it was with the Cistercian order. And so, and when they discovered the Temple of King Solomon, a lot more of that got codified. In fact, one could argue they were not only great military force, they were one of the best construction companies in the world. Knights Templars. They constructed stuff that still stands today. in many cases around, not only around Europe and England, but still stands today in the Middle East. And so you have to understand, well, where did this construction company start? How did they fund themselves? Well, we know they were very wealthy, the bankers, the swathes of lands that were given, the entire economy. Why would they have these swathes of land, and why would they generate a profit and yield from that? Well, they had a massive upkeep cost of building it. Who built the stuff? Well, a lot of it was back then had to be done internally. You couldn't depend on, hey, Mr. King, send me your builders and build this, because the king would be like, well, no, these are my builders and I need them to build my stuff in my cities. So a lot of this is not really explained into great depths in a lot of the books and a lot of the written work, because it's just a lot to go through, and a lot of sometimes in the minds of the historians. Like, well, this is just obvious, isn't it? But for the layman, it isn't obvious. A lot of things are brushed in very large strokes and not really explained in minute detail. And so that's why Masonry, and people call them stonemasons. There's an argument that they were Freemasons and still back. So there is an argument, and it's been debated decades that, ad nauseum, that there were stone guilders, and a lot of people say no, they were stonemasons, and they brought their own kind of quirks and rituals and all that kind of stuff to keep the craft and keep the secrets of the craft in terms of building this stuff within the guild and within the guilders or stonemasons who built it. And that kind of makes sense. This is how corporations back then, if you could call them corporations or tribes or clans, kind of like kept their thing together and made them very unique. So I just wanted to explain that, and then the conversion to Christianity, and the reason why people were very devout in building this stuff, and then suddenly you're building these great fortresses in the name of Christ and God to defend the Holy Land. Well, what great honor would it have been to build these magnificent buildings in the name of your God and in the name of the defense of the Holy Land? And so when you have these massive resources, and then you have the power of what the Templars had, then suddenly all of this stuff made sense. I just wanted to just break that part down in terms of why the construction, let's say, company part of the Knights Templars was so integral, because because it explains all the buildings that they built. It explains all the fortresses that they built. It explains the massive underground network. I mean, just go to Acre. You don't even need to go to Acre. Go see documentaries of the underground network they built under Acre. The massive expense and resource. And even today, you have all these really erudite PhD professors who were there, and they're like, I can't understand how they were able to do this and how they were able to dig and get all the way down here, and the technology tools they'll use. It doesn't make any sense, and why they would do something like this and how they were possible. Well, hold on a second. Just remember, let's just take what's been agreed on some level, 20,000 Templars. Only 10% of your force is military. There isn't an agreement of what percentage were just based on construction, but I would say a lot, right? And again, the way things were built, you would want to keep that within your own order to a great extent, so not to give the enemy the same technology. That's like your military Blackbird plane or your latest missile rocket. Basically, that's how important fortress building, city building, and those type of techs was. And to lose those people to the other side was to lose massive advantage in your upper hand against other enemy factions. And what was learnt very early on in those days was the difference of having the best equipment, of using the best quality stuff. So, for example, I taught briefly on weapon grades. The blacksmiths, who made all the armor? Now, was there a corporation called, I don't know, Blacksmiths R Us, and they would build? Yeah, there wasn't. This was all had to be done internally. Right, remember, they didn't have, they wouldn't go to kings and demand, we are Knights Templars, and because we're Knights Templars, we demand that you make us 50 breastplates and 50 broadswords. They co-opted a lot of that. They got the best blacksmiths, and these blacksmiths, a lot of them were Knight Templar warrior monks, and so they prayed, they ate, they fed well, and then they got into their craft. Now remember, today there are a lot of guys, and especially in America, that as a hobby, some of their love and craft is making like knives. Some of them is like making swords. Some of them is like making old armor. And we have that. There is that around here. People like to make cosplay stuff and that looks like armor but isn't real armor. There's a whole industry now that will make replica armor, and there's a whole craft. Now, these kind of people back then, they'll be doing their labor of love as building these great pieces of weaponry for the Knights Templars, but also as being Knights Templar monks. And we explained why people would want to join a knightly order or a monk order, and the safety that brings. Imagine like, oh, I get to sit down and do something I love every day, which is making, swords and armor and chainmail, and I really enjoy that hobby process, and that hobby process is now my life's work. And as you become a master smith and you get better at it, you're not just making it because you're not making hundreds of thousands of it and being burnt out. You remember, it's for an elite number of knights, so you've got time to really innovate the armor, the weapons, make them better made, make them much more impervious to arrows or attacks by weapons, make the weapons much more deadlier that will cut through, the best of armors and all that and shields and all that. So once you have that mentality, and suddenly you have a network of blacksmiths and foundries around Europe, and even in your local areas in the Holy Land, making all this equipment, and then you have these great naval ships that were basically not only warships, but why did the Templars have a See, this is the things that's not explained that frustrates me sometimes, that we should be explaining. Why did Templars have a massive navy? Well, it wasn't. You hardly hear about major naval battles with the Templar Navy, although there were quite a few, but there wasn't like loads. It was really to transport all these goods that they were producing. So Europe was for them their land-based economies, the sways of agriculture, their foundries of blacksmiths I taught, the builders that they were basically co-opting, all of those, the weavers, the bread makers, the farmers, the armorers, you name it, right? The accountants, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they would ferry the equipment. They would ferry the horses that were bred. They didn't. The sad thing about the Holy Land is that because they were in constant. Normally there was a lot of clashes throughout the Crusades, and there was a lot of back and forth. Their economies weren't as self-sustaining as we thought. A lot of it had to be shipped through. Once Cyprus was claimed by Richard I, that was key. Getting the goods in, and why were the cities that the Christian armies held onto when they lost Jerusalem? If you look at them, they were all on the coastal cities. Why were they coastal cities? Well, that's where they could get all their stuff, because it wasn't the cities that were upkeeping everything that these cities needed to survive against the hostile environment they were in. They needed a lot of support for maintenance, everything the Knights Templars needed, and other orders. And the Knights Templars weren't just doing it for themselves. They were also donating a lot of supplies to the local military, to the local land, to the local kings and fiefdoms there. They put a ton. They backed kingships up. They backed territories up. They kept kings in their seats of power just to maintain the Holy Land. They were the largest corporation. I like to call them corporations. Some do, some don't. They were extraordinarily wealthy because of the banking system they had, and so an immense amount of economic might was put just to hold. They held the Holy Land and those coastal cities for a long time before they lost it, and at a great expense. But for them, this wasn't a corporation that was based on making a profit or giving money to dividends to shareholders. All their resource and time was to protect the pilgrims, protect the cities, and protect Christendom, and to maintain the Holy Land. And their frustrations was not having that unification in Europe where they could reclaim Jerusalem. I mean, you could argue that if Richard I didn't have to go back and settle his issues in England with his brother, who was, taking his place in England, John. He could have taken over Jerusalem. He could have taken over Jerusalem. He was one of the Crusader kings that not only was he formidable, but with the right military support from Europe and from England and from other places, and the Templars had that chance of really taking, and that's what Richard wanted to do. But Richard couldn't do it because he needed to get back, and so he actually made a peace deal with Saladin. This is all written. He made a peace deal, and Saladin accepted the peace deal. Just out of sheer power and strength and what Richard brought to the table in the Holy Land. And the reason why Richard did it is he needs to get out. He needs to go back and maintain his crown. And so if Richard didn't have to deal with that and had that full support and didn't have his brother John who was trying to screw him over in England, we could have had a different outcome. I mean, we don't know how the Crusades, Jerusalem would have been retaken, how long we don't know, but it could have changed the entire, taking that jewel, which is Jerusalem, could have changed our entire history. So what I wanted to explain this show in this episode is the magnitude of what the Knights Templars were as an organization, and how they spent their time in developing their craft. If it wasn't warfare or military, but they were assigned because they loved making stuff, armor, carpentry, food, building, everything mattered. And so what was really exciting was, in a time that was a living hell, joining an order where you as a man, no matter what station you were in your prior life, if you could get in, could then expand and get into different areas of life and focus on somewhere and really shine without having to worry about, oh, you're so and so, or you're a peasant, or you're a serf, or you're a merchant, or you're a lesser noble, or you're a page and your father was a page, and you can show your worth and your ability.
And without worrying that the king was going to come in and take everything you had.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And having that protection of being a Knights Templar and being part of this order, oh my God, you're going to shine. Oh my God, if you had that kind of like that fire inside your belly, and you were really into agriculture and you really wanted to innovate and you really had ideas and you wanted to try it and you talked to the brethren and the brethren kind of worked with you, or if there was a particular, you wanted to expand the capacity of this particular military weapon or whatever it was, you had the ability to shine. But not only that, you had the ability to learn and get experience from the masters of their craft, whether it was the craft of warfare, whether it was from the craft of whatever the craft was, you had the opportunity of being the best you could be. And that was what made the Knights Templar organization so profound. How did the 500, out of 5,000 Templars that were in France when the allegations came through, and suddenly only 10%, which were the frail and the elderly and some of the leaders of Knights Templars that were caught, are found. What happened to the 4,500? What happened to the rest of the Knights Templars who were never really caught or put through the torture and the interrogations in the rest of Europe? Where did they go? Where did all this? I mean, it's easy to say it, but it's harder. And here's the other thing. Remember what we talked about, communication being very hard. We talked about how, villages didn't move that far, and, information was very hard to get to, and to travel, you had to have certain things and travel safely. How did the Templars across all of France were ready and most of them were left? How did the King of France not find one gem or gold coin or Templar silver? And they did have their own Templar silver. So that's the other thing that we don't talk. We kind of touch on it, right? The Templars minted their own silver. They minted their own currency that held weight within the nations. I mean, this was a phenomenal setup that went beyond the other knightly orders. And so it was basically, I guess, an era of enlightenment in terms of the order and what its capabilities were. And within that, and to hold these things together, there were rituals that were put in place to ensure not only loyalty and fealty, but also their devotion to God, which we call in Freemasonry, the Grand Architect of the universe. And so I just wanted to go through that part because the Masonic structure or the Masonry structure of what the Templars did was profound. And you to your question of did they go around and build stuff without taking credit and stuff like that? Well, yeah, they had to. They had to go and fund. They literally were, the crew that would get around and say, how do we fund this wall for this town, because this town needs defenses because it's in the outskirts and close to the Holy Land. How do we fund these ships to get so and so's army, Christian army, to this place here? How do we fund our local area to improve the local area so we get more benefits from it? So very much like what we do today in Masonry is like, how do we support our community? How do we support this, a school or a hospital or a certain charity? Back then it was a bit more, instead of us giving money to some sort of charity or us giving money to some sort of organization that does some good in a local area, the Templars would go and do stuff like that. The Templars will bring out their specialists to build stuff to improve the networks. And that's why they were so integral and so important. And you got to understand, well, why were the kings of Europe so reluctant to go after the Knights Templars beyond France? Because they had that integral value and that worth. And also, one thing that I always say in lectures is, remember we said in episode 11 that the noble sons would be a Knights Templar, and if you weren't a noble son, you were probably a Knights Templar sergeant in that particular military. Remember, only a small portion of the Knights Templars were military men.
Right.
But then again, you can do that, and then if you're in rare circumstances, a Templar sergeant can become a Knights Templar or a non-noble. But my point is like when King Philip the Fair damned the Knights Templars with these false accusations, everyone needs to realize that he also damned the noble sons of Europe, because that's who the military side was. They were the noble sons of Europe. They were the sons of fathers who controlled great swathes of land and political clout among the establishments of the nations of Europe. And there were a lot of ex-Templars as well. There were Templars who would have finished their time and they would have been called back to their land to either take over because, the father died and there was no one else to take over, or the eldest son died and they were the next person in line, or whatever the reason was. And so the allegations were so heinous, and the lawfare, it was literally kind of like, if we talk about lawfare today, basically that happens in these countries that we're in, and political lawfare. That was kind of like your first inception of political Christian lawfare in trying to take down an organization. And what you got to understand before we get into the history and we really zone into the time where Philip the Fair started the accusations and then the fall. Remember, it took 7 years to kill Jacques de Molay. So from 1307, the allegations, and for him to get his way, even after the Pope gave them clemency, which we found out for the Chenin parchments recently, and absolved them, and Philip the Fair was, screw it, I'm going to do it anyway. And the puppet Pope back then, and we'll explain that later, the Pope that never set foot in the papacy in Rome, but was kept in France as hostage, and was selected in France. And that was another massive cataclysm for the Catholic order of Europe, and I'll get into that in the other episodes. It took 7 years to finally damn the Templars. This wasn't like, oh, they're heretics and we're gonna accuse them of demonic worship, sodomy, all these false allegations. All these false allegations, basically. It took 7, and remember, 7 years in that lifetime. If you remember, we're talking about life expectancy. That was
a third of a lifetime.
That was nearly, for a lot of people, that was a third of a lifetime. Whether a third of a lifetime, whether a quarter of a lifetime, whether a fifth of a lifetime, that was a huge part of a lifetime for a lot of people back then, especially even for a king as well, and for a lot of nobles. So it wasn't like, oh, we got you, we found you, you're done. It was, and then the problem we have in our world is because we're so used to the speed and that expediency of, this guy's been called out and the media's all against him or this organization. Because of the 24-hour news cycle and the constant, interwebs and messaging, things happen so rapid. Oh, so-and-so's just, it took 24 hours and this high-level CEO or prime minister or cabinet guy has been forced to resign because of a massive scandal. Back then, you need to realize that they didn't have. It took one of the most powerful kings of Europe 7 years. It was and 7 years of back and forth and fighting because of the power and how integral the Knights Templar were to not only the papacy, but to the construction and to the success of Christendom in that particular. I'm going to go through the kind of you have to just see, after the fall of the Templars, what did you have? You had the massive schism and war between England and France, and I actually call it the French Civil War, because since 1066 it was just French nobility fighting for both lands and to unify the lands. Then you had the 100 Years' War of Roses in England. You had massive schisms in Europe. You've had the rise of a new branch of Christianity, which was Protestantism, and I'll go through that as well. And everything started to the critical point where things started to wind down and Europe started to break apart was damning the Knights Templars, 1307, roughly in that year. That was the start of the end and the breakup of Christianity, and it was in less than 200 years prior after that you had Protestantism come up, and we'll go through that because you had shoots of that in England about 30 or 50 years later, because you have to understand, and this is what we've forgotten. The Templars back then, they were it. This was like the best of the best. These were like the holiest of the holy. The men who took a poverty of chastity. These guys gave everything to Christ, and Europe knew that. And suddenly, your most holy of holiest of knightly order organizations that people romanticized about, the guys who had held the Holy Land,
and they all looked up to him. Everybody looked up to him.
And they all looked up to him. And suddenly, what? They were the most corrupt, and they were the most, then they did this and this and this, and then you find out that, and then the kings of Europe were smart. They knew what Philip the Fair had done. They knew that he illegally elected and put a puppet pope in, and which was a massive schism in Catholicism. The cardinals of Rome, they talked about. And so it created the schism. And so when the kings of Europe were like, well, if King Philip the Fair can do this, who's the next king who can control the Pope? And then it changed. It created a massive schism. So I know I've jumped through a couple of things, but what I really want in this episode for everyone to understand the value that Templary brought, the immense grandeur of this immense organization, this corporation basically that did so much for not only the Holy Land, but for Christendom in itself. And sometimes we fail to explain. Oh yeah. They had massive lands in France in all parts, and yeah, they had acres here, and oh, they had this massive fortress commandery in Paris, and oh, they had swathes of land in Scotland, and we kind of just ignore. Well, what were they doing with all this land? What were they doing with all these buildings? What was going on? It wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. And this was not just like in one country. This was all over. When Portugal was founded, why was a massive swathe of land, a huge amount of land given to Knights Templars in the document that founded Portugal?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it is talked about, but it's done over big brushstrokes, and we haven't got into the minute or small brushstrokes of why, how, and who. Now, what we've got to be careful with is, look at all the little things that the Knights Templars did, and all the little green men they put on, and look at all the pagan stuff that they added on because of all the, stuff they got from the Holy Land and the mystery schools. I would suggest to be very, very careful with that, because I would like for someone to be able to date when those things were added to those buildings, because if you go to Temple, which was Temple in London, which is still there today, there is none of that. There's very little of that. It's a very plain, very humble looking, very beautiful building, temple building, a Knights Templar building. And then when you go to other places where the commander's ruins were, the original concept, they're either in ruins, so you won't see much of it. And you have to understand that in the Renaissance, there were a lot of very wealthy merchants things had changed dramatically in terms of finance, riches, and trade. And so you had a measure amount of wealthy people who had loads of money, whether you're dukes, earls, lords, merchants, who joined in a period of Renaissance where there are a lot of fantasies in the romanticisms, and not only the Middle Ages, but also the ancients, from the pharaohs to the Romans to the Greeks to the Phoenicians to everything. And a lot of them brought a lot of their imagination and stories and the legends that were created and the fiction that was created, and they added to certain chapels, to certain buildings, their own interpretations of what, and that's why sometimes you see some stuff there, and what we haven't done yet, and what we need to do as archaeologists and historians is go back and date how old these pieces are. Were they from the time of the Templars that build these buildings? And that those questions haven't been answered. We go around and look around at these things like, look at this, look at all this pagan stuff and all that kind of stuff. Well, let's date them. Let's figure out. And until you haven't got a date, I'm sorry, I'm very suspect, because a lot of, you have to remember, buildings crumble, buildings die. If you don't maintain a building, if you don't keep restoring it, you're going to have ruins like you have in Scotland, the Scottish commandery near Rosslyn Chapel. Now, Rosslyn Chapel has been carefully restored and renovated and added on, and for centuries, to have that maintained at that detail. And that's the same with a lot of buildings. And you can see that with ancient buildings that haven't been upkeeped, to buildings today that have been upkeeped and renovated and even made modern, at least the interior of the buildings that have been modernized. And so we tend to forget that. If I left this building that I'm living in right now and I wasn't maintaining it over 100, 200 years, or my family through the generations wasn't, this would turn into a dilapidated building. It needs...
Well, think about just on what we have today. If you move out of a house and you got your house for sale and you move out of it, and you're not there with that house, just fixing the small things, you come back in a year and that house is in shambles. Not maybe falling down, but oh my gosh, there's so many things wrong with it. You would think, well, there wasn't nobody there. How'd it get tore up?
Yeah,
It just
absolutely.
happens. It just happens.
Absolutely. Weather conditions through the centuries.
And then we're going to have hundreds of years to that.
And you had hundreds of years of wear and tear and all that kind of stuff. And so those are some things that we'll talk about in later episodes. But what I really wanted to impress upon your minds in this episode was the organizational structure of the Knights Templars. And sometimes we always see, the knight in armor and with the red cross and the shield and armies, and then through the pictures and through Facebooks, and we see one kind of side of what a Knights Templar is, and we always see the militaristic side of the Knights Templars and their weapons and swords and fighting for the Holy Land. And we talk about a lot about the battles and also the fall of the Knights Templars and all that kind of stuff. And we forget. I mean, people don't. Oh, Sam, you're over exaggerating how important Templars were. But hold on a second. Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th is based, and
it's not just a superstitious day.
Yeah, a lot of people. I mean, a lot of historians have now come to have agreed that Friday the 13th was based on the day that Jacques de Molay was burnt on the stake. And that's the reason why it was supposed to be bad luck. Can you imagine, with millions of people in Europe, millions through the decades, who weren't well versed in medieval Crusader history or Templarism, kept saying, "Oh, Friday the 13th. That's an unlucky day." When I was growing up as a kid, and I had no idea what a Knights Templar was, I knew Friday the 13th was unlucky. No one told me why. But Friday the 13th. Well, be careful, that's an unlucky day. That was huge in England. That was huge. And
it was huge over here too, brother.
And in England, they wouldn't explain it. They didn't say, "Oh, it's because of whatever." It was no. It's just, so imagine today, when I was growing up in the 80s, and again, you like yourself when you were growing up, and many others around Europe and around in Americas as well, knowing that Friday the 13th, that survived. That time when Jacques de Molay was burnt, it was such a schism. It was such a schism into the core psyche of the Christian back then, and all around Christendom, and the kings and the churches and the monks and the cardinals. It was such a schism that when I was born in England and I was getting ready, and I was 6, 7 years old, and I was told, "Oh, it's Friday the 13th. Ooh, that's an unlucky day." And and we built our own fables and stuff around about why it was unlucky, or all that. Could be careful about Friday the 13th, and it goes all the way back in 1314 when he was burnt on the stake, and it was on the 13th day, and it was on a Friday. Mate, that's profound on an obscure, on someone who's supposed to be this because in my days when I was growing up, I never heard of Jacques de Molay and the Knights Templars. And then you kind of heard about the Crusades and stuff like that, and you had a bit of an idea of a Knights Templar maybe. It wasn't a huge massive thing that was thrown into your face, but it still survived. Why? If this means nothing and they were just a knightly order that came and disappeared, and everything is just malarkey. Well, in England, when we were growing up, Friday the 13th was a thing. It still is today, and we're in 2025, brother. And back then in 1980, it was centuries have gone down. Why was it? Because it was a schism. Because it was huge. Because history is forgotten. Because a lot of things history was allegoric. It was word to word, mouth to mouth. Remember, those who wrote history were the victors. A lot of the stuff we're finding today is not written by the victors. We're now being able to look at both sides of history. But the history for a big part of time was a propaganda exercise from the kingdoms, and you would only learn one side. And so in this age of enlightenment and discovery, we're able to dig more and actually have critical thinking and understand more. And so and also remember, it was very important that this schism was just wrapped up, biggest cover up in terms of not talking about this particular history and hushing it up and just saying, yes, Friday the 13th was a bad day, is because it was a massive, one could call it, I like to call it the psychic schism that affected Christendom. And there were times where they tried to revitalize it. King Henry V tried to, some of the greatest historians today living, one of them claims that if King Henry V did not die of dysentery, and I want to talk about that in another show that's really interesting, this dysentery stuff. We'll get into that in a bit. And I'll give you my speculations on that. If he had lived longer, he would have united France and England, basically because the French king was dying, and they agreed that when the French king would die, he would get everything. Unfortunately, he died before the French king. That created a massive schism that continued an ugly war between France and England for decades to come. But if he had unified it, the argument was he would have started another crusade, and that crusade would have probably united the Holy Land again under Christendom. You have to remember, it takes a few notable characters with what they've built around them to do stuff like that, whether it's Saladin or whether it's Sultan Mehmet and taking over Constantinople and changing the face. I mean, Constantinople is today's Istanbul. Imagine if Mehmet didn't attack Constantinople. Imagine if the Christians were able to support the Byzantine Empire and, revitalize it, or being taken over by another Christian monarch with a bit more oomph and power and a bit more status, and could rebuild that place. Imagine today modern Turkey being a Christian country. Imagine the effect that when the Sultan took over Constantinople, the Christians then had to go around Africa to do all their trade. They were blocked away from the East. So that's how Africa became a massive resource for the Europeans, not because they wanted to go through it. They actually wanted to go east to get all the spices and the riches from the Silk Road, from China. Asia was rich. Everyone knew Asia was rich. India as well. But they then had to go through, and that's how maybe the African slave trade wouldn't have been as prolific as it had become later on. And remember, the slave trade was a massive thing in the Muslim countries as well as in the East. It was just a nominal thing. But, if you look at the sea patterns and the coastal patterns of where they had to go, Columbus may have not gone to the Caribbeans and founded, it may not have been the conquistadors. Because the main thing was, they wanted to find a route and not having to. They were blocked away from the east because of Constantinople, and they didn't want to go all the way around Africa because that was a massive trek. So they wanted the shortcut. And Columbus thought, well, if I keep going west, I'll get to India or China or whatever, and I don't need to go through all that part and get blockaded by the Ottoman Empire, all that kind of stuff. And so so a lot of history would have changed. This is how dramatic things were. And so the fall of the Templars was huge because Jacques de Molay was getting ready as well. Here's the other thing: Jacques de Molay was getting ready for another crusade. His mission as Grand Master was to go and retake the Holy Land, and he had this, in my opinion, this brute, if I could be, and I'm trying to be kind, Philip the Fair, who, destroyed an order that was integral to the Christian order at the time in Catholicism, and the power structure. And when you took the power structure out, there was a vacuum. And kind of like the papacy became kind of like was castrated of its physical potential political power and was just temporal. And and after that, you just look at history of kind of like the schisms of Christianity beyond that, and then you had, as I said, the breakaway to Protestantism, and then all these other denominations, and where we're at today. So that's why the Knights Templars are still talked about today. A lot of people focus on one particular aspect, but that's pretty much it. I think we're at an hour and 24 minutes. There's a lot more I want to talk about, but I think discussing the organization, let's call it the Templar Corporation, and making people realize how profound, how unique, how immersive and expansive it was, not only for the Holy Land causes, but what it did for Europe as well in terms of its banking organization. That a lot of times I feel hasn't been really explained, and we've only touched the surface. So the first episode talks about, the origins and getting into that. The second episode talks about what life was like and what you had to be as a warrior, and how Knights Templars and the difference in terms of the site and the reason why they were the SAS and Delta Force, and going into the minute detail of what was life like in the Middle Ages, and what was the physical body of a peasant, serf, noble, merchant, and we went a bit of detail into that. This episode, I wanted to cover basically the organization and try and explain it as best that we can with the time that we've got, with how expansive it was, why they were great builders, why they were great farmers, why they were great naval shipbuilders, to give you an understanding for you to go away and do the research. Look at the swathes of land, find out what commanderies they had all over every frigging country in Europe. It's insane. The amount
at least, if not other places as well.
Exactly. And we're just touching the surface. So this is our part 3, and we haven't even got to the Knights Templars getting into Jerusalem and the Rock of the Dome, and how that kind of changed not the order entirely, but actually added to the order of them becoming not only defenders of the faith, but also the defenders of the Christian Abrahamic traditions and the lessons learned from the first temple to the second temple, and how they were able to uncover a lot of historical facts that made them a very profound order, and made them an order of enlightenment and wisdom, and enabled them to do what they did, even though they were your ultimate Christian faith-based order, in the name of, to die in the name of Christ, their Lord and their Savior. And again, all the commanderies were dedicated to St. John the Baptist. And so there's a lot to go into that as well. But what are your thoughts, Billy?
I think this is wonderful. It makes me hungry for more. So I'm looking forward to doing part 4. And I just want to tell everybody that, stick with us. We've got some ideas. Sam is the smart one here, and that's obvious if you've listened to any of these things. You know that he's done the research and he's pulling these out, and they're wonderful. I'm pushing now to do some, after we get done with the Templar episodes, I want to do stuff on the American Civil War, because there was such a rich Masonic thing there. I kind of think that's what reminded a lot of people that they're brothers, and that's what kind of held things together, because there were so many acts of people crossing the line to help a wounded soldier, and they were recognized as another brother. And, they did things like they slipped the other side across, their lines, and kept them safe so it could do a degree for them in the South. Even though they were mortal enemies, they were brothers, and they took care of each other. They helped each other wounded. We got so much. But, just stick with us, share it with your friends, and let's keep this thing going.
Thank you for listening to On the Level Podcast, your Masonic podcast. When you are ready, duly and truly prepared, you can always knock on the door.